All right, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be about American isolationism. The last several lectures have been about the rise of Adolf Hitler and his conquests in Europe. And so today we're going to kind of talk about, what has America been doing while all this is happening? Um, America's, doing what it had been doing for most of its history, which is trying to remain isolationist. From the very beginning, the founding of our country, the United States, because of its geography, has really felt like it can kind of ignore the rest of the world when it chooses to. With the Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe, and with the Pacific Ocean between us and Asia, which, for most of our history was just this insurmountable obstacle between, those different regions of the world. The United States, when it wants to kind of, ignore what's going on in the rest of the world, it really could. And so, we have a long history of that. The Monroe Doctrine essentially had said, look, Europe, we're going to let you kind of do your thing, and we're going to stay out here in the Western Hemisphere and mind our own business. If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. The U.S. had been operating under that for the longest time, and with Teddy Roosevelt, we start to build up our navy, and during industrialization, we start to colonize a few places, particularly out in the Pacific. And so we're kind of inching away from the Monroe Doctrine. But our first gigantic leap away from the Monroe Doctrine was World War One. And after World War One, most Americans, and including the politicians, think that the cost was just too high. Over 100,000 Americans lost their lives. And so there's going to be this desire to return back to isolationism and the Monroe Doctrine, which is probably the exact wrong thing to do. Now, not all Americans believe in isolationism. Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War One, with his 14 points, really talked about an America having a larger role in the international community. And if that would have panned out, maybe the situation in the late 1930s, 1940s would have been different. But unfortunately, we do result back to isolationism. And so what you see here is we've always felt that we have this ability to isolate ourselves because of our geography. And so we're going to try and revert back to that. The World War One was just for most Americans' mind was, this, useless war that, cost 100,000 American lives. And so there's going to be this idea that we should just revert back to our, our isolationist roots. Not everybody is going to agree with that. But for the most part, most Americans feel like we've got too many of our own issues that we need to be dealing with. Those issues primarily being the Great Depression. We think, like, let Europe kind of deal with itself. We've got our own domestic problems that we need to be messing with. That too is probably not the right way to go about things. We start to see higher tariffs during this time period, which decreases global trade, and that's the exact wrong thing to be doing during a Great Depression. We need more trade, not less trade. But the idea was that if we trade more with Europe, we'll find ourselves in another situation like we found ourselves in World War One. We talk about World War One as America siding with Great Britain because we wanted to protect democracy, and that is true. Democracy was at real risk during World War One, and America has been a absolute beacon for democracy around the world. And so we felt like we had to protect Great Britain for that reason. But we also really felt like we had to protect Great Britain because they were, at this point, our largest trading partner. They owed us a bunch of money. And if they lost, we would have lost all that money as well. And so some people associate trading with Europe as picking sides. And if we pick a side and Europe goes to war again, then we will have a financial motivation to go back to war. And so a lot of people are saying, it's just not worth it. Let's not trade with Europe. When in reality, we know that that is, that's wrong too. We've always talked about, in class, we've always talked about, two countries with the McDonald's have never gone to war with each other. It has nothing to do with McDonald's, but it does have to do with trade. The more countries trade with each other, the less likely they are to go to war. So these tariffs are really going to not be able to keep us from going to war. There's one outspoken critic of isolationism, and that is going to be Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss was in Europe. After World War I, he was studying in England, and he really saw firsthand the rise of fascism and recognized that, oh my God, we need to stop this. America needs to do its part. And so you see a lot of Dr. Seuss cartoons that are going to try to explain to Americans why isolationism is bad. And so you can see in the right-hand side of your screen here a Dr. Seuss cartoon about isolationism. I'll read it to you here real quick. I know that the screen kind of cuts off the bottom corner there, but what we see is a old man with a cane at the top of a mountain talking to a whale that is at the top of the mountain. The first thing that should probably jump out at you is, what the heck is a whale doing on the top of a mountain? That's really out of place. And then in the bottom right corner, we actually see the poem that goes along with the picture. And so it's called The Isolationist. Said a whale, there's so much commotion, such fights among the fish in the ocean. I'm saving my scalp, living high on an alp. Dear Lindy, he gave me the notion. So, Dear Lindy is a reference to Charles Lindbergh, who's a member of a group called America First, who is strongly isolationist and thinks that we should not be not be getting involved in Europe. Charles Lindbergh is, one of the most famous Americans at the time, famous pilot. And so, when we go over this poem, what the whale is talking about, there's so much commotion, such fights among the fish in the ocean. So the whale is saying, hey, look, there's all these different fish that are fighting in the ocean. It's chaotic, it's crazy. I don't want to get caught up in that. I'm going to save my scalp and live high on an alp. So I'm going to go as far away from that commotion as possible. Dear Lindy, he gave me the notion. The isolationist gave me that notion. We should isolate ourselves away from all that commotion, all those wars. Well, clearly the fish are the countries of Europe. They're starting to go to war with each other. There's all this chaos, and if we want to protect ourselves, we should move away from that as much as possible. And so the whale is representing the United States. The thing that about that, though, is that to get away from all of this commotion, the whale has to go to the top of a mountain. And what we all know is that if a whale isolates itself on the top of a mountain, that it will die. It can't live without the ocean. And so that's what Dr. Seuss is essentially saying. He's like, look, you can try and be as much of an isolationist as you want, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. You can't isolate yourself from Europe anymore. Industrialization has changed the world too much. We are mass producing goods now, which means we make more than we can buy ourselves. We can't do what we did in the 1800s, which is have a relatively isolated community where we make stuff just to sell to our own citizens. We're past that. We need a relationship with Europe, and if we try and isolate ourselves from that mess, then we're just going to end up dying. And so what is suggested by this is that instead of ignoring the commotion, America needs to play its part to try and settle down the commotion and make sure that all the fish, all the different countries are able to get along and thrive. And so, it's a shot at Charles Lindbergh, it's a shot at America First, and it's a shot at isolationists. So, the push for isolationism in the United States is, going to be pushed by, not only groups like America First, who we'll talk about in detail here in just a little bit, but it's also being pushed by lots of politicians. And what we're going to see is the formation of the NII committee. The NII committee is a congressional committee that is put together by Senator Nye to investigate the reasons why the United States entered World War I. And so the popular opinion is that businesses pushed the American government to go to war in Europe so they could make money. Well, a lot of people believe it because certain industries did make a killing. The ammunition industry in particular just made absolute crazy amounts of money. The food industry made a ton of money as well, at least initially. And so those different businesses certainly did benefit from going to war. There's always, anytime you go to war, there's going to be certain industries that are going to make a killing. And so the NII committee is going to get together. They're going to have, hundreds of witnesses come in, for multiple hearings. They're all going to testify about why they believe that the United States went to war. And honestly, there's going to be very little evidence to support anything except that, yes, the munition industry did, in fact, make money. And so they issue this public statement that is, it's very tailored. The public statement essentially says it's the finding of this committee that, great deals of money had been made by the munitions industry and certain financial groups and manufacturers. And then they leave it implied that it's those different businesses that advocated for war, and that's why we went to war. There really no evidence has ever come up that there was actually a group of manufacturers that politically pushed for the United States to go to war. The war was essentially a choice that Woodrow Wilson and politicians and the people came to on their own. Was there some businessmen pushing for us to go to war? Sure, that probably happened, but there was no real conspiracy. And what the NII committee suggests to the American public is something that the American public wants to hear, is that there is a conspiracy. There's also going to be this kind of implied notion that the Jews had something to do with this. The financial industry has, an overrepresentation of Jewish Americans in it, and so there's going to be this belief that somehow Jews are pulling the strings behind the scenes. That's something that Charles Lindbergh in particular is really going to be pushing. And so the NII committee comes out and essentially says this, and the American public goes, aha, see, this is what happens. We need to make sure we're never in a situation like this again. And so then after the NII committee, we're going to see a series of laws that are going to be specifically designed to make sure that these different companies don't, in fact, influence American politics to push us into a future war. These laws eventually, when it becomes really clear about what Hitler is doing in Europe, and we actually do need to step in, because unlike World War I, World War II is a war of good against evil, and these laws are going to make things more difficult. The laws I'm talking about are the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. We're going to kind of group them all in together. And so what we're going to see is that the first set of laws in 1935, the first set of Neutrality Acts, are going to be much more strict than by the time we get to 1937, because the situation in Europe changes a little bit. But for the most part, what these laws are trying to do is trying to keep us from escalating into a situation where we feel like we have to go to war like we did in World War I, right? And so, the main reasons for going to war during World War I for America anyway were at least as believed by many Americans, was the idea that certain businesses were going to financially benefit from it. The idea that we gave loans to Great Britain, that if they ended up losing, we wouldn't get that money back, and the sinking of the Lusitania. And so the Neutrality Acts try to address all of those issues to make sure we don't have a repeat of World War I. So they're going to forbid the sale of arms to belligerent nations. So if any country's belligerent, so just any nations that are fighting each other, so, to keep the munitions industry from pushing for war, because they're going to make money off of it. So that'll nip that right in the bud. We just say we're not going to allow our companies to sell weapons to countries that are at war. We're going to put a travel ban on belligerent countries' ships, and so we're going to keep Americans off of British ships, French ships, or German ships, because those ships are more likely to sink. Once Americans start dying, what you see is there's going to be American citizens and politicians that are going to start calling for war, for revenge, or for justice, or however you want to think about it. And then the third thing is we're going to start to limit loans to belligerent nations. So if countries are at war with each other and they need loans to fight, we're not going to provide those loans, because again, the logic is, once you provide Great Britain with a loan, if they lose that war, particularly in a war of conquest like Germany's fighting, where they're conquering entire countries, then all of a sudden we won't get paid back that loan. And so there'll be this huge economic reason for America going to war. And so the Neutrality Acts are going to, address all those issues. Now, in 1935, the first ones come out. In 1936, by that point, Italy has invaded Ethiopia. So just to kind of re-emphasize America's desire to be neutral, we're going to see the Neutrality Acts reinforced in 1936. By 1937, however, we start to realize that maybe these things are a little too restrictive. And so we still don't want to go to war in 1937. But by 1937, we're starting to realize there really are good guys and bad guys here, that Germany is clearly, an aggressor nation. Italy, Japan are clearly aggressor nations. And that, again, democracy is in peril. And the German war machine is, by 1937, a formidable thing. And so if, the nations that, Great Britain is still one of our larger international trading partners, even despite of high tariffs. And so we start to realize, like, oh, snap, we might want to be in a position that to help some of these nations. And so by 1937, we're going to see some loopholes being fit into these laws, because even though the American public still wants to stay out of this war at all costs, behind the scenes, a lot of politicians are starting to realize that might not be necessary and we might need to step in. And so by 37, we're going to put some loopholes that are going to say that the president can take some limited action if it's determined that he needs to. And so what that means is we'll be able to sell goods, including weapons and things, to nations that we deem as like national security interests. But it is going to put restrictions on the sale and shipment of those things. And so those countries will have to pay in cash. So that way, they don't owe us, so we don't have to be put into debt. And then, potentially go to war, not us put into debt, but of those nations put into debt and owing us money. So to keep that kind of conflict out, and that the shipment of those guns have to be done on foreign ships. So the no sinking of the Lusitania, right? We're gonna if there's war materials on those ships and that ship gets sunk, it's somebody else's problem, not ours. That is a decent step in the right direction for aid for Great Britain. But what we'll see really quickly, it just won't be enough in the long run, because Great Britain's going to need much more supplies than what they can afford to pay outright with cash. And so we're going to see later on another end run around that with the lend lease and programs like that to try and get Great Britain the aid that they're going to need. Again, and the reason for all this kind of like the loopholes, instead of just coming out and changing the law completely, is because even though politicians are starting to see that we need to make some adjustments by 1937, the American people are still pretty adamantly against going to war again. And so politicians aren't willing to completely revamp these laws because they'll be voted out of office. And so, the driving force behind public opinion are going to be groups like America First. These are isolationists that really want to stay out of the war. Some of them are not just isolationists. Charles Lindbergh is outright, Nazi supporter. And so, this is kind of, he's an outright Nazi supporter before we start to hear reports about what's going on with, work camps, concentration camps, gas chambers, death camps, and such. So these people are going to, be protesting all across the country, trying to keep America out of the war. They include Charles Lindbergh here, who's the most famous American in the country, Father Coughlin, who's got a radio program. He's actually the most listened to radio program in the country. He's the guy that really kind of thought FDR didn't go far enough to help the poor during the Great Depression. And then clearly Senator Nye, the lead of the Nye committee. And so these groups are trying to influence people to keep America out of the war. Like I said before, many of them believe that Great Britain and Jews are trying to drag America back into the war for monetary reasons, for profit. Clearly, this is ridiculous. There's no evidence to suggest that that's the case. There's certainly no conspiracy of any groups to go to war to make money. And so but the America First is really going to promote those kind of ideas. And so it's going to be a relatively popular organization all across America. And so, we're going to see, particularly like out in the Midwest and those regions, we're going to see, a lot of support for groups like America First. Now, the biggest voice against America First is going to be, again, Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is going to be pointing out a lot of the hypocrisy of America First. And so we're going to look at a couple of cartoons here before we finish up. And so we've got here a Dr. Seuss cartoon that is taking a direct shot at America First. What we're looking at here is it looks like a mom or a grandma who is sitting down on a love seat with a couple of kids and reading them a story from a storybook. The mom is wearing an America First sweater, and so clearly she represents America First, and she's reading a book entitled Adolf the Wolf. And so we can assume that that's probably some sort of rip on Little Red Riding Hood. And she's reading this book to the children. And so what she's reading out loud says, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter." Dr. Seuss is not being subtle here. He's essentially saying, look, there's good and evil in the world. And America First is saying, essentially, let's ignore what's going on in Europe because it doesn't really affect us here at home. And Dr. Seuss says, that's bogus, man. Good is good and evil is evil. And if we see the atrocities that we're starting to hear rumors of from from Europe, then it is the responsibility of good people everywhere to stand up to that evil. And so he's essentially, calling out America First for ignoring evil. Now, America First's response to these kind of things is essentially going to be, show me the proof, show me the evidence. By the time these atrocities are happening, Europe's pretty locked down. The average American doesn't have access to that kind of information. There are reports, but they are just reports. Now, the American government knows, FDR knows, you know, well ahead of the American people that these atrocities are being committed, and he's in a tight spot about what to do with it. His wife is very anti-Semitic. We'll talk about the USS St. Louis later, and the terrible tragedy that happens there. But the average American are hearing these reports, and the average American essentially says, well, remember what they said about German atrocities during World War One in Belgium. During World War One, part of the justification for going to war was there were these rumors that the Germans, as they stormed through Belgium, were bayoneting babies in the streets. And so all this violent Hun propaganda was circulating around America. And then by the time the war was over, people started to realize, well, that was just propaganda. It wasn't true. And the all of the attention that was given to that, it looked like manipulation, and honestly, it was. And so we have a boy that cried wolf situation. America First says, oh, those atrocities, they said that about the Germans during World War One. That ended up not being true. So we should just ignore it. It's probably just propaganda again. And so, you got to be real careful when you put out false propaganda like that, because you do get, just like in this situation here, potentially a boy that cried wolf. The atrocities are real this time, and people are ignoring them because of the false World War One propaganda. All right. So we've got another Dr. Seuss political cartoon here. We see a ostrich hat salesman, people lined up to buy their ostrich hats. The thing we think we know about ostriches is that when they're in danger, they bury their head in the ground. The idea is if you can't see the danger goes away. We know that's ridiculous. I don't believe that ostriches actually do that, by the way. But either way, the idea is, instead of facing the danger, ostriches just try to ignore it and hope it goes away. And so we've got the salesman with the sign that says, get your ostrich bonnet here, relieves Hitler headache, forget the terrible news you've read, your mind's at ease in an ostrich head. The Lindy Ostrich Service Inc. Again, taking another shot at Charles Lindbergh. We always were suckers for ridiculous hats, is what the caption says underneath. And so people are lining up to buy the Charles Lindbergh America First propaganda of just ignore it. It's way over there. It'll go away. And, Dr. Seuss is implying that, well, just like the ostrich, if you ignore the problem, it's not going to go away, and you're going to be in a worse situation. We got another one here where we've got a football player and the coach in the locker room going over a blackboard football schematics. And so the football player's got the American flag, so representing the actual United States. The coach, again, with the coach America First, it represents America First. And the coach is talking to the football player, which is America. Remember, no punting, no passing, no plunging, just dig in on the 1-inch line and win. And so that's, talking about America First, and America First promoting the different aspects of laws like the Neutrality Act. Like, we can't get involved, we can't help them, we can't do all that. But we expect America to, be able to still be a winner here at home. And so America First isn't saying like no military, no defense. They do believe in defending our own shores and being able to, protect America itself. But it kind of hamstrings our defense when we won't help out our allies. All right, and the last political cartoon that we're going to look at today, this one again, Dr. Seuss. It's a boxer in a ring. The boxer is wearing an American flag hat and shorts. This is clearly meant to look like Uncle Sam. He's got his boxing gloves on. He's in the corner, ready for a fight, and we see that the boxer has his ankles tied together by a rope with an iron and a tin can, the tin can to make noise, the dead cat is just like weights, things holding him back, and a letter that says best lunk Sam from America first. And so the clear implication is, as the wording on the top says, all set to answer the bell. So America, Dr. Seuss is implying America needs to be getting ready for a fight. That's why it's a boxer, and that the fight is coming whether we want it or not. And when the bell rings, and the fight has started. And America First and its policies have essentially handicapped America. What good is a boxer if the boxer's feet are tied together? It's going to make things much more difficult. And that's what Dr. Seuss is saying America First is just slowing us down. It's keeping us from preparing from a fight that looks like it's probably going to be inevitable. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.